Welcome to Pixel Latte, a show about video games and stuff. Sometimes you can see that stuff. Sometimes you can't. And sometimes those things are intertangled. This week, we're talking about Outer Wilds, a 2019 space anthropology astrophysics time loop game by developer Mobius Digital. I'm your host, Lee, some guy with degrees in philosophy, religion, and communication. And like most people with multiple advanced degrees, I think that makes me qualified to talk about things I'm not qualified to talk about. I'm joined, as always, by the hostess with the mostest, the man whose name never changes, the defender of tomorrow himself, Jace. Jace, how are you? How goes the defensive Piltover?
It's going great. We have this little uprising right now, but we're increasing investments and belief in hex tech, and we think that we can really squash this rebellion with some aggressive force, like you should all rebellions, really.
Yeah. No, totally. And I'm glad you're not letting the lamestream media get to you, and you seem in high spirits. I welcome our discussion here in a few minutes. So this week on the show, we're talking about Outer Wilds, a 2019 game by Mobius Digital that puts you in the boots of a Hearthian astronaut. In case you're wondering, that's an alien astronaut. And you are stuck in the last 22 minutes of a dying solar system. There are no enemies to fight. There are no stats to level. There are no skins to unlock. In short, it is the worst possible game for me to play. Instead, it is just you, your wits, some wooden or naturey spaceflight gear, and you got a mystery to solve. It's your job to discover why the sun keeps exploding and what that has to do with an ancient forerunner race known as the Nomai. So that's what Outer Wilds is at its core. But what makes this game really special, and the reason why we want to talk about it today, is how it uses those core mechanics to tell you really interesting, scientifically grounded, philosophically compelling, and indeed at times touching story.
Yeah, I think a great way to begin understanding what Outer Wilds is understanding how it parses out portions of whether it's a science fiction or a fantasy game. And I think that Outer Wilds in particular here, it kind of mixes or blends those where the barriers can be hard to parse. But I like to think of it mechanically constructed as a very science fiction game, and science fiction certainly influences how the story is told, whereas fantasy itself can describe portions of the narrative and other content. But science fiction, I think a lot of us sort of have an intuitive understanding of what science fiction is, which is grounded in the plausible, though may not be here right now, science, technology, and the ways that those can inform the storytelling devices. Whereas fantasy is more about the impossible and how that is grounded in the story, and then also how metaphors can then be constructed out of those to tell stories. Now, neither is better than the other, but I do think that Outer Wilds does have its own unique way of utilizing both. Mechanically, for science fiction and the way that science fiction imparts itself on the game, you have the sort of insane astrophysics that drive the construction of the world that you're navigating around in. So all the planets in the system that you're exploring, the Hearthian system, they are modeled accurately, to the astrophysics that we understand. But more than that, they orbit around the universe, the sun at the center of it, by gravitational pull, not pre-baked paths, right? Which is pretty unique because even in a lot of simulational games, if you will, gravity itself is not the force that's driving the planets. But the crazy physics don't end there. They go down to even how your character navigates and moves around the game world. Jumping, the mere act of jumping, is about exerting force against a planet or a body, and it also exerting force back. And the way that gravity influences, or the lack of gravity influences, trajectory, and the way that you navigate around is interesting. And I can't think of many games that have made like such an engaging mechanic out of just moving around gravity. Oftentimes in games, like you get to these sections lacking gravity. I'm thinking like Borderlands, the pre-sequel, which is basically the entire game, and other things, and you eventually find yourself like bored of, working with gravity, and it's sort of this like very baked thing, whereas like the simulation of gravity here is so compelling and interesting that I never found myself tiring of it. But it also poses a challenge, right? And I think that's another way in which science fiction leaves a very interesting touch on the game. The game is often pushing back against you in various ways. You know, you have black holes that you need to contend with that'll suck you in, or you have to worry about gravity pulling you into the sun if you step away from your game for a few minutes, which has certainly not happened to me at all. But you also,
Nor I. Nor
or
I.
you,
Not multiple times. No, sir.
not at all. But even just jumping around a planet, right? Each planet has its own sort of gravitational pull, some stronger or weaker than others, which makes jumping around interesting. And I more than once have left the orbit of a planet, left the planet entirely by jumping too far, and then been stranded in space, which is, yeah, probably not the best way to die. In fact, there's a lot of really unpleasant ways to die, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. There is this existential horror that is baked into the game, and it's a sort of tonal horror, very existential horror that you don't. In my opinion, I'm not a horror aficionado like you are, Jace, but that you don't really see a lot in, at least in Western horror movies, Western horror series. Correct?
Correct.
It's more jump
Yeah.
scary. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that this sort of existential dread that you're talking about, certainly you don't see it often in media. It's not the common type of horror that tends to be portrayed in even film, right? But you do occasionally find it, and I think in games it's even rare. I can think of only few instances really that hit on the existential dread. Maybe something like Soma, right? But it really
Yeah.
is a rare occurrence.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that makes Outer Wilds unique is that it's very like it's both cheery, but it's not like the We Happy Few sort of cheery horror. It's like, life is cheery, but there's this like brooding existential horror in the background. The horror of suddenly hurtling into space or getting eaten by this giant anglerfish, right? And so part of what's going on at the same time, part of what makes this game interesting to me is the mechanic of the time loop and what they're trying to do narratively with this time loop. It's not just a mechanical device, it's also a narrative device, right? And so if you have been playing video games in the past 2 years, I'm sure you've noticed that time loops have become very popular. And it's not just because they speak to, the boring white collar, oh, every day is the same. It's been 2019 for the third year, right? That sort of talk, but also because time loops are ultimately a sort of fantasy, right? So the key to breaking a time loop is curing an individual anxiety through sheer repetitive grit, through the mastery of the mundane, through seeing all these possible avenues that could exist, and you pick the best one, right? So going back to that anxiety in Edge of Tomorrow, right, which is a 2014 film starring Tom Cruise, the key to breaking that loop is for Tom Cruise to not be a coward anymore, right? And Groundhog Day, which I would argue is probably one of the most famous time loop narratives that we have, Bill Murray's lack of compassion, that's what needs to be solved in that movie. Take it a step further, right? So these narratives, they often embrace or flirt with nihilism, right? So a good, more niche example that's going to make me sound really smart is 12:01 p.m., a 1990 film starring Kurtwood Smith, which is the dad from That 70s Show, who is doomed to live the same hour for eternity, his lunch break, no matter what he does. And the movie does not, it's a short film, does not end very happily at all, right? Deathloop, very similar. So Deathloop argues that, if you're stuck in a time loop and no one else can remember what you do, then what's wrong with the most violent expressions of sadism, right? And it's actually nothing. It suggests that if you're stuck in that sort of time loop, gleeful hedonism, gleeful destruction of others, that is a key to consciousness, to meaning making, to individualism. Not the case at all in Outer Wilds. So again, Outer Wilds, we have this tonal existential horror. Most of these planets, they're inhospitable. All it takes is, like Jay said, just one extra jump in the wrong direction, and suddenly you're in space, slowly asphyxiating, right? And yet, despite that, life goes on these planets somewhere. There's a fellow Hearthian astronaut who's by a campfire, who is eager to share a marshmallow, a tale, a moment of quiet respite, broken only by the low hum of their instrument. And every single Hearthian in this game is so fucking wholesome, right? So my favorite is in Giant's Deep, where you meet Gabbro, Gabbro. So he is the only other person in the galaxy that knows you are also in a time loop, and there's this whirling maelstrom of water. It's a terrible place to live, and this dude is chilling out like he is in Hawaii in the middle of the summer.
I have
He's
to
like,
jump
hey,
in here. This dude is also my favorite. He is like the manifestation of a capybara. The dude is just
yeah,
living through literal like a shitstorm, right? And he's just there chilling in a meditative state. It's brilliant.
yeah, he's just like, hey, buddy, it's good to see you. He's like, this rain, it doesn't bother me. And every astronaut, to an extent, is like that. But more importantly, they're proud of you, because space travel is hard. It's really hard in Outer Wilds, right? It's even harder in real life, I would assume, right? And yet, despite your best efforts, you will never stop the end of the solar system in this game. the sun, it's going to explode. This loop that you've been in for 15, 20 hours, that was just an accidental delaying of the inevitable. The solar system doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about the nomai. It doesn't care about those fucking ship-eating fish that ruined my game. And, the solar system existed long before you arrived, and it will continue to exist regardless of what you do, and it's going to exist after the sun explodes. And I think for me, that's a very positive, wholesome message from a game that is very can be very dark and foreboding.
I think that this contrast at the center of the game between the sort of tonal dissonance and the message that's being conveyed by the narrative is a part of its appeal and part of what makes it novel as a science fiction work, as a game, but just more broadly.
Yeah, I agree. And the part that really ties this whole point for me is at the end of the game. And it's specifically the way the game uses the final song to drive home its core point. So at the end of the game, you have to gather your fellow astronauts together for one final song around the campfire. It is a slow, obtuse, sometimes confusing process that forces you to find these relics or symbols of the people that you've met. Jace, why don't you go ahead and play the final song for me? So it starts out simply enough, right? It's just one instrument. You've only talked to one astronaut. You might remember this instrument from earlier in the game. You've heard it 1,000 times. It's this core riff, this core pattern, this core theme. And then as you talk to each astronaut, a new instrument gets added, a new melody, a new chorus, a new echo. And eventually, even the last nomai joins in. So, by now, everyone you've met in this game, they're at the campfire. And this melody, it wasn't possible for when it was just one of them, just two of them. And it just starts to soar. And I still get chills just listening to it, even months after beating this game, right? So you're with your friends and you look up and there's this great big ball of light. It's one final explosion. You couldn't stop it this time. And the game ends. Now, if we were playing the game, we would hear this thunderous, symphonic, joyous crash of music. The game is over, but it is not a sad moment. It is a bittersweet moment. It is a happy moment. Now, this is the official OST, so things go a little bit differently. Instead, the music starts to fade. Your journey, the journey of the Hearthians, the Nomai, is coming to a close. The song starts to dissolve. All those instruments fade away. And now it's just noise. But then you hear a familiar riff. It's that same theme, that same song you've heard 1,000 times while playing it. You heard it in the main menu, you heard it in Timber Hearth, you heard it just a few minutes ago, the very beginning of this song. But it's by itself, it's a little different. It's the same story, just told a little differently. And it is a beautiful, bittersweet song full of hope and sadness and joy and life. And it is one of the few moments in video games that just really sticks out to me. And it really sticks out, if you get the canon ending, it shows you the next generation of adventurers. And it's a beautiful moment for a beautiful game.
It's a very moving song, right? And I think that It's what gives this game such a personable and human touch, that you have this sort of cold, uncaring universe, very mathematical renditions of, gravitational forces and pulls. You have all these very scientific and accurate things, which could be cold, but it's aspects like this, moments like this, that really add a warmth to the game, that really color the experience and make it so much more cozy to play than it ever could have been.
Cozy and just so refreshingly egalitarian, right?
Dude, so egalitarian. And I think that that moves us on to kind of another interesting aspect of the game, which is that, like you said, Lee, the game can be quite horrific and cold at various points, but it does, as noted, feel different when playing it. And that is a lot of to do with the sort of social fabric of the Nomai and Harthians themselves. You sort of start the game navigating through the Harthian village or town at the center of Timber Hearth. And when you go through it, you navigate, you interact with many people, and each one sort of brings their own experiences to you. But in hearing their experiences, you begin to understand the value and how everyone interacts as a society. Even the lumberjack, for example, is deeply valued and not necessarily seen as more than the people exploring space. In fact, the people exploring space don't seem to be of more material wealth or have any more status than, the portraits and some of the documents in the museum there. And so in a real way, you get a sense that everyone's looking out for each other and everyone is working very collectively to build a very wholesome society. And the Nomai sort of also have a very similar structure. Now, they are organized into clans that travel through spaceships or vessels, as they're known in the game, to outer reaches of the universe, and they try to discover and uncover new scientific phenomena to expand their knowledge, and then they all come back together every 10 years to sort of share their knowledge, right? And I think that this is pretty notable, right? In sort of how the Nomai kind of went about this exploration. They were very non-interventionist in sort of how they went about it and how they expressed moral concern even in pursuing greater science and technology. So, for example, on Timber Hearth, as you're exploring the game, you find some mines within Timber Hearth where they're extracting material resources for some of their larger projects that they're doing hundreds of thousands of years before you're being in the game. And when you explore this cave system, this extraction site, you find writings that explain how far that the Nomai went to make sure they didn't disrupt what were clearly early signs of life developing in the system. And that even at these very sort of, you couldn't say primordial, but, life was some plants and some tadpoles, that there was this great extent of moral concern, which is refreshing in a landscape of games that seems to reduce most non-player characters into like material resources, right? The way that this is portrayed. More than that, is the Nomai and their relationship to imperialism, or the lack of. And in our world, we see that imperial power and technology are often interwoven. America is a superpower, but also a technical powerhouse. And technology is often used in service of maintaining that power and often leads to exploiting those in the global and south. Science and technology in Outer Wilds is not for an individual or person, as expressed by the Nomai, but it is seemingly for everyone in both the Harthian and Nomai societies. Technology promotes the clan or community goals instead of driving them all insane and extracting from the poor. Arguably, the distinction here, and I think the key one, is that the Nomai have a different value system that's sort of driving their science and technological pursuits. The Nomai are not developing it in pursuit of capital or sort of abstract material wealth or gain, right? But they're doing it in sort of service of their communities and service of each other and in service of moving the whole forward. And I think that this is fascinating and this is telling, right? And this is to get super deep into the hole here with kind of what I'm extracting from the game or what it's making me think about. But I would say that Outer Wilds is not explicitly a deeply political game. It's not Disco Elysium by any stretch. It's not 1/1000th of Disco Elysium, but it is intentional in its design and sort of the relationships it forms, and it does tell an interesting story. The nomai and how they relate to each other, technological and scientific advancement, and more importantly, others, demonstrates that science and technology are not a part of politics but deeply connected. The political questions and values driving scientific and technological expansion define how science and technology will fundamentally be used in a society. And these are some of the questions that Outer Wilds brings up. When I was playing Outer Wilds specifically, one thing I couldn't stop thinking about was that how advanced the nomai were, but how separated they were from sort of capital expansionist or imperialist means. And this makes you think of sort of how, these systems of exploitation, they often externalize that to others, but it also leads to sort of internal rot and exploitation of the population within, and how it's been told by many smarter people than I, how that can limit a society's own growth. And it really does pose the question, would the nomai have ever made it as far as they did if they were structured differently? And are we, as a reflection of that, are we holding ourselves back in terms of how we structure our social and political fabrics? And I mean, I'm posing it there, but I think the answer is probably so. But it's fascinating that a game, ostensibly not super political in itself, can pose these sort of questions, right?
There are just tons of these tiny little details in the game that just make it so good. Like, it's, astrophysics simulation aside, it's a deceptively simple game, right? So one of the things that I really appreciate about the social, political structure of the game is the the way the Herthians are gender neutral, right? It's just this tiny little detail. It actually doesn't really mean that much in the grand scheme of what they're trying to do with the narrative, but it is just this tiny little thing that adds so much, makes the narrative so much richer, and it also shows how intentional the developers were about this, right? This was not an accident. And so the developers, Mobius Digital, they have a fantastic series of development blogs, one of which is devoted to translating the game, one of which is devoted to the difficulty they had translating the game's narrative, which is originally English, into languages where male and female pronouns are used and male pronouns are considered the default. And so, for example, German is very heavily gendered. And so they opted to write around the notion of gender in the game. And so it's a very conscious, intentional decision. And so I'm going to read their justification here. Quote, "We feel that Herthians don't have a concept of gender for themselves, not considering themselves intergender or a specific new form. We want to avoid using disruptive or new language for them, since this is never specifically addressed or explained, and we don't want players to be addressed in a gender identity that they don't feel comfortable with, when the more appropriate idea is that the player is interacting with a race that doesn't feel the need to address sex that way at all. The Herthians built their connections without gender, their friendships, and also their own identity. We hope that we were able to allow players to be part of the Outer Wilds venture in this way." And so this really, especially now, for context, the Cyberpunk PS5 patch finally dropped. And the thing that's irritating about that game is you can choose penis 1, penis 2, or vagina, but you can't choose, your gender, your pronouns. And it's so stupid that in a Cyberpunk game, you can't do that. And here you have this tiny little indie game where they were very thoughtful about something as seemingly mundane, but it's so extraordinarily important both in people's lived experiences, but then also in the experience of playing a game where you have to be able to understand the narrative to solve the puzzles, right? That they were so conscious about pronouns, right? And gender expression. And so I don't want to get too much into the whole romantic Germanic languages translation. That's a rabbit hole. But I just want to note it, while we're talking about the social fabric.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to really go back on that cyberpunk story there, I think it's deeply saddening, but you and I, we both know the reason that cyberpunk has that problem. And it really comes down to the fact that it's only a AAA game and not a quadruple A game. They just didn't have the budget to fit those options in.
Poor struggling indie developers CD Projekt Red just didn't quite have enough money. Yeah.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
just a few more $1 billion and they would have had it, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, they just need to crunch their workers more. That's definitely the solution. Just squeeze out the maximum amount of profit.
Exactly. Now you've got it. And another thing there that you said that I think really stood out to me was that the game seems really simple on the surface, but there's a quote here. This comes from programming, so I apologize, but simple isn't easy, right? And I think that is a broadly applicable statement in a lot of ways, but what seems simple on the surface can take an excruciating amount of time and effort to get across. The way that the sort of like genderless references, or not genderless, but gender neutral, my apologies, references are used in the Harthian language, it's so natural that, and maybe this is just me being slow or whatever, but I did not catch that until like my second or third playthrough, right? It's so naturally woven into the language of the game that it's not even just that they're intentionally trying this design, but it's like woven in very carefully.
Yeah, and that really so I'm playing Lost Ark right now, and one of the things that's very annoying is that they made, and I could be wrong here, but I believe they made some of the characters black or brown when they were originally white in the Korean version, and that's all they did. They just were like fresh coat of paint.
Oh
And it's
no.
and it's like that is perhaps well intentioned. That is the exact sort of thing that makes quote unquote SJWs and quote unquote anti SJWs so irate, right? It's like a critical race bingo card, right? Or like separating like a class of students based on their eye color, and then treating the students with brown eyes worse, which by the way, brown people tend to have brown eyes, right? It's so stupid. And the Outer Wilds is almost like a indirect refutation of that sort of like ham-handed approach to, frankly, being intentional about what you're doing, about incorporating diverse voices and diverse experiences. And it's just this little studio that did it, right? They don't have EA money, at least when they were making this. And it's just very refreshing.
Yeah, it's very interesting playing this game, and in particular playing this game after the 15th year of 2019, as you said earlier. The way that this game relates to the politics of science is something that stuck out to me when playing it. We're living through a time right now when there's many figureheads, many air quote scientists and other specialists kind of like opining on the state of the world, opining on the pandemic and what we should or should not do. And we have this kind of exhausting and depressing debate about the fundamentals of science. And this makes me think of the, I would say, probably modern classic book, Merchants of Doubt, right? In a particular quote in it that I want to read here real quickly. While the idea of equal time for opposing opinions makes sense in a two-party political system, it does not work for science because science is not about opinion, it is about evidence. It is about claims that can be and have been tested through scientific research, experiments, experience, and observation, research that is then subject to critical review by a jury of scientific peers. Claims that have not gone through that process or have gone through it and failed are not scientific and do not deserve equal time in scientific debate. Yet what we see today is the exact opposite, and the fundamentals are debated, and we see sort of like wonky perspectives about vaccines, about the shape of the planet, frankly, like given far more airtime than they ever should be. And in Outer Wilds, it's like the debate, this where it is on the spectrum, has shifted so far that there is debate. For example, the Nomai, they do debate science, but not on this fundamental level. They go further out. So, for example, they're in the Harthian system hundreds of thousands of years before you are, because they're searching for something known as the eye of the universe, and this is a signal that it's emitting a signal that seems to predate the universe itself, and this is fascinating to them. And so they're out here exploring it. They come up with an ambitious project to really discover the source of the signal and get there. And this ambitious project would take a ton of power to fuel. And the only way they can think of doing it is by triggering the sun to go supernova at the center of the Harthian system. This would irreparably end the system and all possibility of future life in it, which, given our discussion about the Timber Hearth earlier and how they were so cautious about it, certainly sparked debate within their system or within their community. And one Nomai in particular, Idea, and I might be mispronouncing that name, expressed some moral concern with the potential annihilation of an entire star system is too severe a cost. We shouldn't build the sun station no matter how badly we want the knowledge that comes with it. Now, I don't know about you, but destroying a star system in pursuit of knowledge is pretty extreme. But that is the level of debate that Nomai and Outer Wilds is often caught up in terms of science, right? And again, on Earth right now, we have those who doubt climate change, those who doubt vaccines, those who think our vaccines have microchips and some elaborate Bill Gates plot to do, I don't know, make us all install Windows in our body. I'm not quite sure what the plan is there, what the end game is. And these are just this is the tip of the conspiratorial iceberg that runs very deep and is probably melting pretty quickly if climate change has anything to say about it.
But
But more than that, I think that this game, it gives a unique experience by moving the discussion in the direction that it does and moving it out of these fundamental levels. And it's a reflection of, some of what I would want in our own reality. And this is part of the escapism of Outer Wilds. It constructs a universe, though full of tragedy, is ultimately one that feels hopeful in the face of it, where social and political conflicts are not the factors moving society, and people seem to care about each other on a fundamental level. Outer Wilds has many lessons and stories tucked away within it, but it feels oddly like wrapping up in a warm blanket next to a campfire with some marshmallows. It teaches us to seek out others, and that in the face of existential dread, we are all we have. And that what is driving science and technology is fundamentally as important as the science and technology itself. What more could you want from a work of science fiction?
wow, look at that. You brought it all the way around to the first points we made.
I also went through first grade writing classes.
All right, well, that brings us into our final segment. That's right, we're doing segments now. We're calling it The Good, The Bad, and the say it with me. Oh my God! So, since we are, we'll just say a video game essay channel, of course, we need to start with the why. And the why really goes back 8,000 years ago when human beings first entered. I'm just fucking with you. So it's pretty self-explanatory. We both love JoJo, some of us more than others, perhaps disturbingly so. And it turns out we're really bad at wrapping up an episode. So we're going to take turns saying what we like about the show, not the show, the game. So that's the good. What we don't like, that's the bad. And the thing that made us go, holy shit, either figuratively or literally. And so, Jace, go first. What's the good thing about this game?
So, a lot of things stuck out to me, but I'm going to follow the rules here. I'm going to follow the rules. The soundtrack. I think the soundtrack was amazing, and it was moving in so many ways. The soundtrack to this game is good in and of itself, but the way that the soundtrack plays off of various experiences, like, when you hear these synth lines and arpeggios come in, that the end of the universe is coming. The star going supernova is happening, and it's such a moving experience how the soundtrack can elate the entire game or move it up in quality. And so I think the soundtrack to this game is absolutely fire and adds meaning to so many different moments in it. What about you, Lee?
So we've talked a lot about this game's narrative and what it's trying to say about politics and science and all this other wonderful stuff. We haven't given enough airtime to just how technically mind-bogglingly impressive this game is, right? So, we said at the top, it's simulating gravity for an entire galaxy, and this level of attention extends to the planets themselves too. So my favorite thing about this game is Brittle Hollow, which is this planet with a giant black hole in the center that is being constantly bombarded by rocks from a volcanic moon, and this causes the ground to literally crumble beneath your foot. And so you have to, you got to book it there if you want to find everything, because literally pathways will disappear Sometimes it's you're walking on them, and as the loop progresses, and it is a planet that is so technically impressive that it has spawned several standalone articles about it. It is one of the few times that a video game has made me like audibly gasp. Like the first time I went down below the surface and I saw the black hole, I was just like, wow. It just blew me away at how impressive it was. So that's the good. On to the negative. Jace, what is the one bad thing about the game?
The one bad thing, I mean, that's hard, but because to me, it is a collection of sort of minor bugs and glitches, right? So I would personally rank this game as, one of my favorite games of all times, and I rate it very highly, but it isn't without its bugs and technical glitches. One particular notable one that certainly frustrated me getting started with the game for this video was a saving glitch where I would do the intro of the game and engage the loop, and then it would just fail to save after that point. And so I had to replay the opening section of the game probably like 5 or 6 times. And then I had to, scrub through some online forums. And eventually I found a way to get the game to save. But that was certainly frustrating. And although I love the game to bits, maybe got it off on the wrong foot when I came back around to it.
So for me, I actually just did not like this game at all, to be perfectly frank. And if we weren't doing it for the show, I probably would have never gotten past the first 15 minutes. There's something about this game, the way it forces you to think just does not jive with me. I when I played it, I kept thinking about the times that I spent on a couple of anthropology, archaeology digs. And it's just mind-numbingly dull work. There are absolutely no zombies, no Nazis, no lost arks, no crystal skulls. You were just in this like 9 foot by 9 foot hole, and you're digging smaller squares of holes to sometimes find a shard of pottery, and then maybe if you're lucky, you'll put that pot together and you'll figure out something about the people that live there. And that is not me, and that is what this game is. It is just mind-numbingly dull anthropology work, and the fact that you have to think not just like what's in front of you, but what happened 10 minutes ago and what happened 10 minutes in the future on a different planet. It just all makes my brain hurt, and at times I got stuck because I missed a room and I didn't know that was where the solution to the puzzle was. And for me, it was just it's a game that I have a lot of respect for. I have a lot of admiration for on like a technical level, on a narrative level, but I would rather shoot myself into the sun than play this game again. So that is my bad thing about the game. So then we'll go into the best part. Chase, would you like the honors?
Yes. Let's see here. So my oh my god moment is the sun station. That entire segment of the game is sort of like a narrative peak, one of many narrative peaks. But the mechanical experience of getting to the sun station and then being on a satellite that's orbiting so close to the fiery sun, and then having to jump across sides of it, when you can like literally see the flames of the sun coming up between you. It was a very intense moment. And I think my palms got so sweaty, my controller actually slipped out of my hands once while doing it. And then I subsequently flew into the sun.
Were your knees weak, mom spaghetti, by any chance?
Yes, absolutely. My whole body was a pile of spaghetti.
So my holy shit is actually the Interloper. You're talking about narrative peaks and valleys, and this is one hell of a peak, right? So the Interloper is this icy comet that goes throughout the galaxy. I know there's between universe and galaxy. And it passes by each planet, right? And it also passes by the sun. And spoiler alert for anyone trying to do this puzzle, but you have to wait an obnoxiously long time for the entrance to a cave in the Interloper to open. And when you go
it's
into
like 5 minutes. What is your concept
that's
of waiting?
Way too long. I need immediate feedback, immediate gratification. And so once you go in there, it's this cool like little sliding puzzle, and you whip around the corner and you discover the the tragic end of the nomai and why there were no nomai. And it is a very it's very sad. It's very, it sort of drives home that idea that life is very fleeting, and be it hurtling into the sun station or hurtling into space or forgetting to put on your spacesuit, or getting eaten by a giant fish. There are a myriad of ways to die. And so that's just I think a really strong moment in the game's narrative.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that brings us not only to the end of our segment, but the end of our show and the end of our first season. Yeah, bet you didn't know we were doing seasons. We didn't either. So we're gonna take a break. I mean, we always take breaks, so this is just gonna be a slightly longer break. But when we return, it'll be season 2. And I hear that we won't be able to let sleeping dogs rest. Perhaps,
Yeah, we'll let the cats sleep, but the dogs are gonna rise.
Yeah, we're gonna let the dogs out. So be sure to check us out sometime in May, June, probably not July, I hope, but you never know, for the start of our new open-ended season 2.
See you then.
Bye, everybody.